Well, hello there, history fans. I'm Dr. Larry Sabula from Eastern Washington University. And the video you're about to watch is a recording of a book talk by Dr. Michael Hattem about his book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of book talks with some of our extraordinary faculty here at Eastern Washington University. Dr. Hattem teaches in our online master's degree, and he's been doing that for 3 years. In subsequent book talks, we'll bring forward some of the other scholars who teach in both our online and our campus programs. We'll record these as a service to the community, I suppose, and to be available to the larger Eastern community in particular. This was our first time through, so be a little forgiving of me. The sound quality is not quite what it could be at the beginning. It took me a little while to figure out how to turn off that little ding sound that Zoom makes when new people join the meeting. And I understand a few of you tried to log in and had trouble. And to those of you in that boat, I apologize. We'll get it right next time. Anyway, it came off very well. Dr. Hattem is a brilliant scholar, and I hope you enjoy this talk. Thank you. All right, welcome everybody. If I could ask everybody to mute themselves. I should have set that up for you coming in that way. Okay, we may as well begin. Well, thank you everybody for coming. It's good to see some familiar faces and some new ones as well. This is the first, what I hope will be a series of book talks from the master's program at Eastern Washington University. And some of you are former students of that program, some of you are current, some of you are teachers out there, and some of you are just members of the public who perhaps don't have a master's in history. And I know how embarrassing that can be. You're at a party or something and people are talking about where they got their master's in history, and you fall silent. Well, I'm here to tell you, Eastern Washington University is here for you. We have an online master's in history with fabulous faculty such as Dr. Michael Hattem. It's all online, and you should check us out. I am recording this, so keep that in mind. The way this is going to work is Dr. Hattem will give his talk about 35 minutes about his amazing new book here. And then there'll be time for questions. And I'll start off and you can ask your own as it goes. And if you have to leave or something or at some point, this will be recorded. Anyway, so appreciate all of you here. Let me introduce our guest. Dr. Hattem has a PhD from Yale University in 2017. He's the author of two books. His first, which came out just a few years ago, how quickly do you write books, Michael? Well, I'll ask you that afterwards. His first book was Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. And the last feels to me, the second feels to me kind of like a sequel, The Memory of 76. That's the book we're talking about today, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. Dr. Hattem is the Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. He's been teaching in the online MA in history right from the beginning. And you've taught 10 classes for us, 12, 16? Oh, that's right. Yeah, you teach two of them a lot. And I am both proud and pained to say he is, according to the students, the most popular instructor of the program, with not accepting myself. So with that, Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I am going to, first I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see if this, there we go. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to begin with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society nearly a decade ago now. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine, around the turn of the 19th century. And in January 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg, a former Continental Army officer who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the revolutionary hero. And Papa, I will tell you, what I want more than anything I think of at present is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name, she asked. But then she went a step further. Papa, had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still, but I suppose this is impracticable. But Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. And 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, the Washington's personal secretary, in which he wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair which I have now the honor to include." Shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail, and inside were 2 envelopes, one marked "Read this first." And in that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington." And then he wrote, "I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." And Eliza described what happened next. She wrote, "I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. Imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift." "How shall I duly honor the relic?" she wrote. "I feel as if it was too great for me to possess, and I want to give thousands who've never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But Eliza's health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. She wrote, "The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister. I wish it may be preserved in our own family while it can be safe." Now, Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Now, the reason that I'm telling you this story about Eliza is it's about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It's really emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the American Revolution that Americans began to forge in the early 19th century, particularly as they realized that the revolutionary generation was rapidly disappearing. And that emotional connection really has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I want to begin my talk tonight by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years. And I think that more deeply understanding that relationship has a lot to tell us about the past, the present, and the future, particularly as we continue barreling our way towards the 250th anniversary of independence. The memory of the American Revolution, I argue in my book, is our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth, I think, in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or a people came to be, and a story that defines its character and principles, and in doing that also expresses a vision of the future. So to mythologize the revolution is really not to just tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but is really to tell the story of the revolution to explain how the United States came to be, to define its character, and to set the agenda for the nation's future. And so I want to really explore tonight what it actually means that we have mythologized the revolution, how that has worked, and what it tells us about Americans' relationship to their revolution. Now, myths are first and foremost stories, and like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act focuses on the coming of the revolution. It features a succession of legislation and events, the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, all the way up to the Declaration of Independence. The second act features the war and is typically structured around a timeline of major battles. If we think about the Battle of Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. And then the third and final act typically recounts how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And so this story structure has a logical beginning, middle, and an end, and that has given the telling of the revolution a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way that Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it is a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I want to argue that how Americans have told the story of the revolution has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, the hero, or in our case, the sort of revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. And after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over the colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. And this leads to the creation of a Continental Congress. And typically, the hero, initially at least, resists the call to adventure. And of course, throughout 1774 and 75, Congress really refused to consider independence and instead focused on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And of course, in July 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. Now, the hero then undergoes a sort of series of trials and temptations. And for the revolution, these trials are typically represented by many of the war's battles. And though some of these stories are rooted in actual history, some of the most famous stories of the war feature in their retelling sort of mythical themes and scenarios. If we think about, the famous story of the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, when, so the story goes that, penned in along the East River by the British Army, George Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under the cover of darkness and thanks to an opportune fog. And that avoids a likely early end to the revolution. There's also the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, when Washington crosses the Delaware River in the middle of the night with his ragtag army and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians just days before the army's enlistments are about to end. Now, these kinds of tales have really lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution in popular memory. And though these stories are rooted in actual historical events, they've been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, right? And including telling them as though they represented direct interventions by God. And this sort of lends a predestined or even providential nature to the origin myth. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. Like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible in 1781, and that effectively ends the war and secures American independence. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states, But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach what's called the moment of atonement. And so they call a constitutional convention in 1787. And then once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, the Constitution, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better, thanks to the hero having undertaken their adventure. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us without being explicit. The sort of mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West really have culturally hardwired us in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses, not least because hero myths were part of ancient religions and civic histories. And that the story of the revolution has often been told like this, I think helps us better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. These kinds of stories kindle intense emotional connections, in part because they're usually intended to foster one sense of belonging to a community. And of course, Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger than life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seemingly providential victory against all odds over the world's most evil empire. And there is a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. And many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, especially in the 19th century, I think have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. And this mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic mythical past replete with heroes and villains and peril and daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. And throughout, there is a sense that good and evil exist and that they're clearly delineated and that the former triumphs over the latter. Uh, this memory of the revolution is a myth of the beginning of a new age that casts Americans as both its heralds and its heirs. And this has really uh, given to the popular memory of the revolution a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny for more than 2 centuries. And I think that this is why in no small part at least, why the revolution has been so central to our politics, our culture, and our national identity. And I think that understanding the form in which the story has been told helps us understand Americans' emotional connections to this origin story. And another way that we might try to get at that is through a field of study known as fandom studies. And fandom studies actually explores how people and groups relate to these kinds of stories and to other facets of popular culture, how they express their deep emotional connections to these stories and how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that fans do these things is through conventions, right? If we think about Comic-Con, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to express their connections to them. And in some sense, Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th, every time they visit places like Mount Vernon, Independence Hall, the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way that fans express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in cosplay, where they dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. Still another way these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter or countless others. And Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction. And that is, stories that are set in the Revolutionary era and often feature real life characters. And one of the most popular of those in the 20th century was Johnny Tremaine. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art. or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes from the stories. And we might think about John Trumbull's famous painting of the Declaration of Independence, or Emanuel Lewitz's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware as examples of Revolution fan art. And one final way I'll mention, this is not a comprehensive list, but is that fans like to visit recreations of the world of their stories, right? Fans of Harry Potter can go to Universal Studios and walk down Diagon Alley, and Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the set of the Shire. And they do this because they want to inhabit the stories that they love and the characters they have a connection to, because it strengthens their connection to them and to the community of fans. And this is the same reason that many people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg or the Boston Freedom Trail or Independence National Historical Park. And so we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution are similar to these fan cultures, which are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish such deep emotional connections to these stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity and lead them to create a sort of shared community around this fandom. And of course, nations are in no small part held together by the stories that they tell about themselves and their origins. In that sense, nations are as much a literary creation as they are a political creation. And I think, this is not to equate necessarily, fandom and nationalism, but I do think that the similarities suggest something really even more elemental about how we as humans relate to mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us. So I would argue that the power of the memory of the American Revolution comes in no small part because it's an origin myth told in the form of a hero myth. And I think that this has contributed to Americans developing a unique emotional connection to the memory of the revolution. There is another origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination that goes back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And I think this also helps us understand this connection to the memory of the revolution and our use of it. In the 18th century, many British subjects thought that history was cyclical rather than linear. And that is, empires and civilizations kind of rose when people had a real desire for political power and economic prosperity. But that once a society achieved, those things, its people tended to become more concerned with their own self-interest over the public good, and this would always lead to that society's inevitable decline. And British thinkers, believing that this cycle had played out across history, in the early 18th century, argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote unquote first principles. And of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in the revolution. And I would argue, and you would see in my book, that the conflicts that we have had over the meaning and the legacy of the founding for the last 250 years really have been in no small part about choosing, defining, and justifying the most important first principles of the revolution. And so, as I show in my book, which first principles Americans choose to attribute to the revolution and how they define them really has changed quite drastically over time. And there's often been multiple conflicting definitions and meanings given to the revolution at any given time. And so this idea of returning to first principles to forestall an inevitable decline kind of suggests that there is a kind of protection in looking back to the past. And so whether Americans are aware of it or not, we've sort of inherited and intensified this notion that there is some kind of protection to be had from looking back to our founding. But what Americans have done over the last quarter of a millennium with this emotional connection, what first principles they've found in the revolution and used the revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. And this is really what the the body of my book explores these many conflicts over, the meanings that are being attributed to the revolution at any given time, and competing memories in different periods of American history. And that's because even within the general story structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. And that's what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling or interpreting a story about the past to attribute specific meanings to it. And as my book shows, Americans have interpreted the revolution and its meaning in many different and often directly conflicting ways. Um, the thing about the memory of the revolution, or the revolution itself, is that the revolution was too rich and complex an event carried out by too diverse an array of peoples to ever really be distilled into a single story or narrative, or to have one single meaning. After all, the founding generation itself never agreed on what the revolution meant or what its first principles were. And so, in other words, this book shows that there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. As a national origin myth, that sort of complexity has allowed the popular memory of the revolution to be constantly contested and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to the revolution often reflect our own times, and are typically intended to justify previously held beliefs. And so when we talk about the revolution, it often reveals far more about the present than the past, and far more about us than about the revolution. And I argue in the book that the revolution is basically, the memory of the revolution has provided a sort of shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. And so I'm going to give you an example of that from the early to mid-19th century. For much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the Union of the States. And for that reason, the most important part of the document was the grievances and the final paragraph, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. But that really began to change only in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence as being defined by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. And abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mention the Declaration, including notably in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831, which you can see here. This is one of the most important abolitionist newspapers of the era. And in introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. He writes, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." And then he continued, assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. Abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. Now, this did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a South Carolinian newspaper in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, all men are created equal, as, quote, merely a rhetorical flourish, and claimed, quote, that upon this proposition, false as it is, rest the wild theories of liberty held by so many, meaning the abolitionists. In the hands of the abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, a very seditious instrument. And that's because for them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the revolution, not the Declaration. And that's because the Constitution had been Southerners' best tool for protecting slavery through repeated compromises over new states being admitted to the Union, and other legislation like the Fugitive Slave Act, Supreme Court decisions like the Dred Scott case. But in the 1840s, William Lloyd Garrison and his followers also began to see the Constitution as the greatest impediment to abolition. And that notion was actually stoked by the first publication of James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1840. Until then, Americans knew really very little about what had happened at the Constitutional Convention. But in 1844, Wendell Phillips published the compilation of the portions of the notes that dealt with slavery in a book called The Constitution of Pro-Slavery Compact. And this was to show, quote, most clearly the details of the compromise that was made between freedom and slavery in 1787. For Garrison, Phillips, and their followers, the Constitution was corrupted from the start because of this compromise. And so Garrisonians began to call for disunion because they believed slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises to slaveholders. Not all abolitionists agreed. Frederick Douglass, a former ally of Garrison, in his famous speech on July 5th, 1852, said, quote, "I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution. It is a slander upon their memory, and interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." This reinterpretation of the Constitution by abolitionists as a pro-slavery document culminated in a famous incident on July 4th, 1854, in Framingham, Massachusetts. During his speech, Garrison pulled out his pocket copy of the Constitution, which he called a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and then set it aflame as the crowd cheered. These two founding documents were seen by both sides, abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners, as fundamentally different and in opposition to one another. There's the Radical Declaration with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, and then there's the Constitution, which established and maintained law and order and slavery. And abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document and hence which principles defined the revolution and by extension the nation. In some sense, the abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. Now, this is just one example of many partisan conflicts over the memory of the revolution in my book. But I would like to also, before I stop, I would like to give you an example, tell you a little story that gives you an example of how not just partisan division can change the memory of the revolution, but how international politics and foreign policy can do this as well. So this is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And after the success of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, he became convinced that a similar large-scale historical epic film about the American Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution, which he was going to write, direct, and produce himself. He did that, and his film, The Spirit of 76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the U.S. had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. Now, throughout the 19th century, Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But relations between the two countries had become more friendly around the turn of the 20th century. Now, in attendance at this pre-screening in Chicago were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. And though the one critic described the film as patriotic, the head of the censor board, a man named Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, he disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities. There was one scene where a British soldier ransacking an American house sticks his bayonet through a baby's crib. There's another that showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. And these scenes, he said, would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of our allies in the present war. And so Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Now, eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show the film so long as he deleted these offending scenes. And we don't know why, but before the film premiered proper in Los Angeles in November of 1917, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. and he was arrested immediately after the premiere and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. Bail was set at $10,000. The LA Daily Times ran the headline, "War of Revolution Film Seized by Government." The case went to trial, and it was presided over by, I kid you not, Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The media reported unfounded rumors that Goldstein was a German agent and that the film was German propaganda. And eventually, Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. Now, Goldstein was eventually released from prison early in 1921, but after an unsuccessful effort to revive the film, he eventually had to leave the United States for Europe in search of work. He last turns up in the historical record in Berlin in 1935, where he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. Now, this story is an example of how the politics of the times can shape the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film that was based on a memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. And his story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we're young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and as newer memories of the revolution emerge to challenge or replace it. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If he had released the film a few years earlier or a few years later, things likely would have turned out very differently for him. But instead, Goldstein was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is now lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of '76 has ever been found. And this is just one example of how foreign affairs can have an impact on the memory of the revolution. And in the book, I also talk about how the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and then the end of the Cold War in the 1990s also caused really significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. So to conclude, in this talk, I've tried to explore just what it means that we mythologize the revolution, to say a little bit about how that has actually worked and how it has played out in the practice of American politics. And at the heart of all of this really is the importance of how we tell the story of the revolution. And if readers should take anything away from this book, it should be a greater awareness of the importance of how we tell the story of the revolution, whether it's an unqualified triumph, a hypocritical failure, or anywhere in between. I've also tried to show that how we have told the story of the revolution has fostered this unusual emotional connection between Americans and their founding as a way of helping to better understand the revolution's unique role in our political culture. Because the purpose of a national origin myth is to define and justify first principles and political agendas, conflicts over different memories of the revolution have been constant throughout American history. And that is because the memory of the revolution really has provided us with this sort of shared political language that allows it to be an important tool for communicating across the many divides that are inherent in such a diverse nation and polity. And so in that sense, the memory of the revolution has been an important way that Americans have expressed their political beliefs, both in the present and their visions of the future. And it has long been part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. And each new generation really has produced multiple new memories of the revolution, often in direct conflict with one another. And as a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we're sort of looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. The memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. So thank you.
Well, that was terrific, Michael. Well, you think we'd all be better at Zoom in this point in time, but there we go. That was great. Thanks so much. I've got some questions and I'll open it up to the public. And I've got some pictures to show you, sort of revolutionary things in the Northwest and ask you some
Oh, great.
questions about them. Yeah, yeah. I thought it'd be fun. Um, I enjoyed this book so much, especially the different chapter titles, which sort of really tell the story. There's a chapter called The Confederate Revolution, The Abolitionist Revolution, The Progressive Revolution, The Great Depression Revolution, The Cold War Revolution, and so on. And it struck me how much our opinion of the Constitution has changed from generation to generation. I think for most of us, not being aware of it. I think I grew up in the Cold War revolution just because of the age of my teachers and didn't question it until I got to graduate school. And of course, people have their own interpretations of the revolution right now. Going to my first photograph here, or my first image, about a year ago, I was driving in Spokane. I was driving my Toyota Prius with my hippie bumper stickers, and some very large pickup truck was behind me and angry that I wasn't going more quickly, and eventually found a place where he could race around me. And then he slows way down and he presses a button on his dash, and black smoke begins, billowing out from the tailpipe. I don't know if you have this in Connecticut. It's called coal rolling. People spend about $1,200 to modify their trucks so it'll blow soot.
I've
Upon
never heard that in Connecticut.
Yeah, yeah, coal rolling, and he had this bumper sticker. Um, let's see if I can. There we go.
Yeah.
Do you know what that is, Michael?
Yeah, that is, I mean, I don't know what we call it a logo. It is a graphic from a group called the Three Percenters, which is a far right wing militia group. Um, of relatively recent vintage. In the book, I talk about um, the rise of the first far right militia groups out of the anti-communist movement in the 1960s, and how they used the memory of the revolution to justify um, their groups and their ideological beliefs. And of course, in the 1990s, there was a sort of revival of these far-right militia groups, especially after what happened at Waco. If anybody is old enough like me to remember the Oklahoma City bombings, um, uh, the remind me of his name, Larry. I
Oh,
forget.
I'm forgetting too now the main bomber.
Timothy something. It's slipping.
Timothy McVeigh.
Timothy McVeigh, that's it. When McVeigh, who perpetrated the bombing in Oklahoma City of a federal building, when he was arrested, he was wearing a T-shirt with a Thomas Jefferson quote. And so we are now in the midst of a sort of third revival of these far right militia groups, and they still very much draw on the memory of the revolution. And what the three is about is it's based on um, a just a wrong historical notion that 3% of the population during the revolution fought the revolution. It's the idea, if we think about it, it's the idea that that there was a revolutionary vanguard of men who were willing to fight for the revolution. And so the three percenters, they have adopted that name quite ironically in some sense, unironically on their part, but ironically for a historian because it's based on a completely false historical assumption. But yeah, and I from my reading, the Pacific Northwest has always been a sort of a hotspot for these kinds of groups.
and the inland Northwest in particular, I'm afraid. A little more cheery, just a couple of historic photos here. Um, oops.
Ah,
Oh,
yeah. Don't stump me.
there we go.
Here we go. Okay, so this is fantastic. Uh, so and I talk about this in the book. In 1915, the after the Civil War, in the decades after the Civil War, the Liberty Bell went on a number of trips to various fairs and big events. They went to St. Louis, they went to Louisiana, went to a bunch of places. And part of the idea was, that um, it was part of the healing of the nation after the Civil War, but that Philadelphia was going to contribute to the reconciliation of the North and South by allowing the Liberty Bell to travel to the South and for people to see it and become reconnected to the United States through the memory of the Revolution. And in 1915, the Liberty Bell went on its last tour. It's the last time that it would ever leave Philadelphia. And it was a cross-country tour to San Francisco for the Panama Pacific International Exhibition. And this was a months-long exposition, sort of kind of a World's Fair on the West Coast. And the Liberty Bell traveled from Philadelphia all the way across the sort of northern Midwest, up to the Pacific Northwest, and then down to San Francisco. And then on the way back, it traveled through the Southwest and deep South on its way back to Philadelphia. And this event, was really was a national it was a truly national event. It was people came out to see the Liberty Bell, which would stop at various, even small towns. It would stop. It might stop for 10 minutes, but and in bigger cities it might stop for a few hours. But the Liberty Bell was placed on a car of the train, an open car, so that you could see it just with the train passing by, and it was illuminated at night. We have lots of accounts of people who, traveled miles and miles, walked miles barefoot to see the Liberty Bell pass by. It was a sort of national occurrence, and there are lots of pictures that I found that are out there that were taken at various places across the nation of people, visiting the Liberty Bell. This is one from Seattle. There are a bunch from the Pacific Northwest that I found. I include two of them in the book. There's stories about, elderly people coming up and kissing the bell like it's a sacred relic. There's unfortunately in at a stop in Texas, a young African American girl kissed the bell and it almost set off a riot, and that was reported in the national newspapers as well. So the idea, was that the Liberty Bell is going to travel across the country, and that this would raise patriotic sentiment uh, and uh, help increase support for the U.S. entering World War I. That was the sort of the motivations behind the trip. But the trip was a real memorable event. And the thing that's really interesting about it to me is that, you know, uh, certainly after the Civil War, uh, the memory of the revolution to someone growing up in California in the late 19th or early 20th century is quite different to somebody who grows up in the Northeast, where you are in the place where the revolution happened, right? But people out west, grew up 3,000 miles away, as far away from where the revolution happened as, people in the Northeast were from England, right? Uh, and so there was different ways that Westerners, let's say, developed and established their connection to the American Revolution. And in the book, I talk about how this 1915 tour of the Liberty Bell actually played a significant role in that.
We good.
It's a
Just
great
a
book.
couple. Yeah, just a couple more. This is a few blocks from my house.
Yeah.
Um,
So 1932 is the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. It was it was a significant event. The in 1926 was the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now, the centennial in 1876 had been celebrated widely across the country. It was a major national event. Um, but the 150th anniversary of 1926 really kind of wasn't, um, partly because Americans needed the centennial in 1876, right? It's the end of Reconstruction. There is all kinds of political conflict going on in terms of the Hayes election. Um, and there's also an economic downturn that is setting in. So there was a real sort of need for a nationwide celebration or commemoration of the revolution. But that in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, um, that was not needed so much, and so it didn't really get that much attention. But of course, by 1932, the Roaring Twenties was well and truly over, and the Great Depression was well and truly underway, and a lot more attention was given to the bicentennial of Washington's birth, and so it was a significant event. There was a federal commission that was created to, organize the festivities and whatnot. One of the things I talk about in the book that came out of it is, um, as the New Deal was starting to take shape, right around this time, there was a distinct effort by the anti-New Deal business community to reclaim or to claim George Washington, for themselves and to tie themselves to the memory of the revolution. And so they did this by trying to reclaim Washington and cast him as, the sort of one of the nation's first businessmen. And
right.
there's lots of pamphlets from chambers of commerce talking about what a business genius Washington was, and of course it's uh, not and very little of it mentioned slavery, of course, but yeah, this was a national event, and the fact that you have one of those right near your house is absolutely no surprise to me.
Well, compared to Jefferson, he was a pretty good businessman. Just one last one because I love this picture. This is here in Spokane, Isabel Johnson Savage Conway, and you can't quite read the plaque, but she's a real daughter of the American Revolution, which is to say her father fought in the Revolution. She's the only person so identified in the state of Washington. The
Is that
daughter,
true?
yeah,
Really
yeah, yeah.
interesting. So this is quite interesting. The Daughters of the American Revolution play a not insignificant role in the second half of my book in some unfortunate ways. The group was created in the 1890s, um, uh, for descendants of people who could be people who were verified descendants of men who had fought in the American Revolution. So it was a hereditary patriotic society. And part of the reason I argue in the book that these groups emerge in the 1890s, has to do with this is really the beginning of this period of massive immigration to the United States, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, so like the less desirable parts of Europe, as they would have been perceived then, and this massive influx of foreigners and immigrants caused no small amount of concern amongst elites, that the true sense of Americanism, as they called it, was going to be diluted by these large numbers of immigrants, and there's a sense of that in today's immigration debate as well. Um, and so, they set up programs where they would instruct new immigrants in the what Americanism was, the true meanings of the revolution. And then, of course, in the 19 teens and 20s, and then all the way into the 50s and 60s, the Daughters of the Revolution became quite a prominent anti-communist group. And uh, and perpetuated, a lot of the worst tendencies of the anti-communist movement. Um, but interestingly, though, in recent decades, I want to say that the DAR admitted its first African American member. in the 1980s. And in the decades since, the DAR and other organizations like it, including the Sons of the American Revolution, which predates the DAR by a few years, um, uh, have come a long way from where they were in decades past, to be more inclusive. But of course, their political and racial history has been quite checkered.
Yeah, I should say we've got a couple of different DAR groups in Spokane, and one of them, the Esther Reed chapter, is really quite progressive, and they've put in some very interesting and positive historical interpretation.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they've become they have they have a net positive effect, I think, these days that that was not the case many years ago. Though I will tell you, I have a Google alert set up for the term "memory of the American Revolution," and almost every alert I get is an obituary notice of a DAR member.
very
So
good.
yeah, I kind of I feel like I should have been able to predict that.
Well, if anybody else has questions, go ahead and raise your hand or turn your camera on and wave back and forth. Ella, if I can ask you to keep an eye out on those people and to unmute them when they do that. Let me ask you while we're waiting for that a little bit more about your writing process. So your first book came out what in 2000, you said,
2020.
and this 2020. So I'm sorry, and this book just 4 years later. That's pretty impressive for a guy who's got a day job. What are your writing habits like?
I mean, the first book was my dissertation, and it was finished. I mean, I had a contract for that as soon as like the summer after graduate school, and I had readers' reports right away by the fall that really didn't require much revision, fortunately. But then, so I could have published it even sooner, but I was on the job market and I kept putting it off for that reason. But by 2020, I just wanted it to come out. But this book I knew was going to be my next project even before I finished the dissertation. And part of that came from like experiencing the Hamilton phenomenon, in the mid 2010s. And my graduate advisor was Joanne Freeman. And so she was kind of like in the middle
Okay.
of all of that. And I just looked at that Hamilton musical and it just seemed like such an expression of the sort of Obama era politics, more than it was about anything having to do with the revolution. And that sort of set me to thinking about the memory of the revolution. And it had been many, many years since somebody had, tackled the memory of the revolution in this kind of way since the bicentennial, really. So there was an open gap there. And my first teaching assignment was at the New School in New York City, and they told me I could teach whatever I wanted. So I created a course based on this book, basically, or I should say the book is based on that course. And I taught that again at Knox College. So basically, the book came out so quickly because I started working on it immediately in 2017, but also because I got to teach it twice. And I really learned how valuable teaching your own research is and how much teaching can shape your own research.
Students are such a valuable audience because you have to convince them to care
Yeah.
about this. You have to show that it's relevant. So what are your writing habits like? How do what do you set aside time to research each day? Do you set aside time to write? Do you grab it when you can?
Like with the research, it was the research. I mean, I don't have a schedule, but like the research happens because I want to do it, like so it gets done. I did most of the research and writing, at night. I have three kids and I work during the day. So most of, the research and writing was done at night, or on weekends. And a big chunk of that, I started writing it I researched it from 17 to 2021. And then I started writing in 2021. It was still the pandemic. It was, there was still a lot of shutdowns. So I was home a lot and I just really took advantage of that, you know. Uh, and it took about 2 years to write the book, but the only reason it went so quickly was because I had taught those two classes. I had been doing the research for 5 years at that point, and also because I am an incessant outliner. you know. And I always remind students of this in my research course in 532 about how important it is to outline, whenever you're writing anything research based or really anything, because, you have to have a roadmap. You can't start and not know where you're going. And I found, whenever both my books, when I started writing, I already had a chapter outline. And in some sense, I also had, basic, points, say, under each chapter of what I was going to cover in each chapter. So I could see the book at a glance even before I'd written anything. And you can move things around, of course, at any time. But so, the big part of my process is outlining, and that's one of the things I try to impart to my students in the program.
Very good. To the audience, do you have any questions? Ella, has anybody raised their hand? No, she's there. Well, I've got a couple more. How do you keep track of your research? Do you use a software program? Do you have a bunch of?
Yeah, I use this program called Scrivener. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It
Mhm.
was created for screenwriters. Um, uh, I don't know, 10, maybe 15 years ago. I started using it for the dissertation, and it's basically just like it's like a word processor, but also you can just dump any file, any kind of file type into it, and you can view it in the program. So I could like you can have multiple windows, so I could have like my chapter on the top, and I could be reading a document underneath it. I could use the file structure in what it calls the binder in the sidebar, and put documents and primary sources into folders based on the topic that they were, and stuff like that. So that program was really is really critical to my sort of method. But really, I always tell my students too is that whatever method you choose, you should have your method set out at the beginning of your process. You can't come up with a different method in the middle of it. You should know, how am I going to store my primary sources? How am I going to take notes on them? And then, you always know where to find something, and you have some kind of basic system. And I always say, that being organized about your research is really like half the battle.
I was cleaning out the basement a couple months ago and found this giant cardboard box full of 4x6 note cards that is in fact my first book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is the that was the pre-digital way for all historians. The funny thing is that in Scrivener, each document also gets like a virtual index card, you
Okay,
know.
that's the bridge for me right there. And I stood with this in my hand mic on there. Well, obviously I need to throw this out, but it represents so many hours of my life. So, but I pitched it. Last question. I think I'll let you go unless the audience wants to chime in. So I know you've got another topic cooking up, another book in mind, because everybody does. What are you thinking about writing about next?
All right. So I actually did not until just a few days ago. Um, I have been thinking about a book about the generation gap between founders. If we, even in this talk, I said the revolutionary generation. The revolutionaries actually came from three distinct generations. There is the generation of, let's say, Benjamin Franklin, who was born in 1706, who, that generation I call the imperialists. They're born in the British Empire. They're riding or dying with the British Empire. And a lot of them were prominent in the 1760s during the imperial crisis, the early part of the imperial crisis. And they're writing about, not about independence, they're writing about how can we reform our relationship to the British Empire. And then the second generation is born, between 1730 and 1750. I call them the independents. And they're the people we mostly think of as the founders. Washington, Jefferson, these kinds of people. And they're the generation that basically takes over the imperial crisis about halfway through, and pushes the way towards independence. And then the third generation, born after 1750, between 1750 and 1776, are people like James Madison, James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton. These are people who may have fought in the war, or may not have, but they're people who, by the time they came of age politically, they had no experience living as a subject of the British Empire. And so they come to, this moment in the 1790s. These are the people who create the first party system. They're the ones who create party politics. And I call that generation the partisans, because most of the previous generation did not want parties. And so I've been playing with this idea of these three generations and thinking about it's not that there's some consensus between how they all think the same about things, but how they all shared a specific context, right? That first generation would have shared a specific context in the first half of the 18th century, the same thing for that independent generation, and then the same thing for the last. They would have all had unique contexts that helped shape the politics of their times. And then there's also these really there's incidents where the generations overlap, and that causes some real tension in terms of the politics of the revolution. So Revolutionary Generations is my tentative title.
Mhm.
How the generation gap between founders shaped the American Revolution. That's my potential next
Glad
book.
we didn't do this book talk last week,
Yeah.
before
Uh,
you had us.
yeah.
Sounds great. I see Tom Robinson has a question. And Tom, you are unmuted. You should be able to ask it. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I know you're speaking only about history tonight, but I'm just wondering if you're willing to speak about any modern events that revolve around the Constitution. Anything from the Second Amendment to the meaning in uh, the the preamble to the Constitution, whatever you would be happy to speak about.
Yeah. So in the book, one of the things that I was kind of a little bit surprised about um, was in the book in the bicentennial chapters, I found just how much of the modern conservative memory of the revolution, how much a big chunk of it comes from the Cold War period. And this is the idea that the revolution was about individual liberty, limited government, and free trade. That's a product of the 1950s primarily. Um, and and then during the bicentennial, and in its afterlife, what I call its afterlife in the 1980s, there are a number of additions made to that memory. And one of those things is this reinterpretation of the Second Amendment. Uh, Another is because that's when, the NRA gets sort of taken over by the conservative wing of the group, and starts to really perpetuate this new interpretation of the Second Amendment. Another product of the bicentennial era, the 70s and 80s, is originalism. That was not, that was not a thing before the bicentennial, basically. People had ideas about strict constructionism when they read the Constitution, but that's different. And so originalism really comes to the fore in the 1970s alongside the Second Amendment. And then a third thing that emerges in the conservative memory of the revolution in the 70s and 80s is the beginnings of this idea of Christian nationalism. We begin to see that really come to the fore in the 1970s and 1980s. 1976 we think of as the year of the bicentennial, but Newsweek magazine ran a famous cover that called 1976 the year of the evangelical, because evangelicals were starting to come back into the political sphere in a way they really hadn't since the 1920s, since the Scopes trial. So, and then I talk about also how then in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan really pushed that and the Christian nationalism angle, and really added that to the conservative memory of the revolution. So, when Larry was talking about how we think about the Constitution has changed, those are, I mean, 50 years ago now, but relatively recent developments in how we think about the Constitution. But also, there's a real effort to portray those ideas as if they are traced back to the founding generation, right? As if the founding generation shared those ideas about the Second Amendment, about originalism, when of course they did not. Those are, much more modern interpretations of the Constitution.
I'm thinking about that George Washington monument from 1932 I showed you. It has a list of his virtues. It doesn't say Christian on it at that point.
Washington was a distinctly unpious president. And if anybody know the story about Parson Weems, who wrote the most famous biography of him after he died. That's where the cherry tree story comes from, right? The famous cherry tree story. That's where the story of Washington praying in the woods at Valley Forge, which became a popular painting in the 19th century. And the big part of what Weems was doing with those stories was to try to make Washington more palatable to second great awakening evangelicals, and during the 2016 election, when I found an image of Washington praying at Valley Forge in the woods, but someone had superimposed Donald Trump's face on it. And of course, I thought, well, it's doing the same work. It's trying to make a person who is not very religious, but trying to depict him in that way to make him palatable to the evangelical community. So,
as you were talking, I was kind of frantically Googling, trying to find that, of course, that Washington praying at Valley Forge, which is an invented thing itself. And there's there's stained glass of it in the Capitol, and I can't quite find the date of when that stained glass went in. I think it's a 20th century kind of thing. Okay, is there anybody else who want to go ahead and wave? I'm going to just quickly go through and make sure there's nobody waving at me, or just speak up if you can unmute yourself. Okay. Well, I think we're all set. This has just been a terrific talk. I thank you so much for it. If you want more Michael Hattem out there, people, enroll for a master's degree from Eastern Washington University, or read one of his two great books. I'm sorry, go ahead. What was that?
We'd love to see, we'd love to see more students in History 532 and 534.
Yeah, very good. And I will
It's
say,
also an audio. The book is also an audio. I purchased that.
There is an audiobook version. That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
that's right. That's how you know Michael's a big shot. They make audio books of his books when they come out. They don't do that for some of us. No. Okay, and then thank all of you for being here. If you have any questions about the MA, reach out to me. If you want Michael Adams' email address, I might share that with you as well. And thank you for everyone for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Adios.